Ring in 2024 at the New Year's Eve Masquerade Gala at the Oceanfront Atlantic Sands Hotel in beautiful Rehoboth Beach with an open bar, surf and turf dinner, Prosecco wall, raw bar, hors d'oeuvres, and desserts. It'll be the ultimate toast along Rehoboth Beach. $459 per couple includes gala, one-night stay, and New Year's Day brunch, or $169 per person for the gala only. Book now and call 302-227-2511 or go to AtlanticHotel.com. That's AtlanticHotel.com.
The Revolutionary War started as a colonial rebellion against the British on the fringes of its empire. It ended with an independent America and the idea of liberty spreading across the globe. All this happened because the rebels won the major battles. We're here to dive deep into each of them. Welcome to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast, hosted by James Early and Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on Key Battles in the Revolutionary War. In the last episode, covering Bunker Hill, we saw that both sides realized this is not going to be a short conflict. Early on, the British hoped that they could crush the rebels decisively once and for all. The Patriots, or the Proto-Americans, whatever you want to call them, were less optimistic that this thing could be done over with quickly, because I knew the British wouldn't back down. But as higher-ups in the British Army are coming to the colonies, things are getting down to business, and tiny little skirmishes that are noteworthy but not really that big in scale. We're getting past that, and now we're really getting into the big guns. So, James, ready to take out the large bayonets and affix them to our muskets?
Yes, let's do that.
All right, let's bayonet fence.
Charge. We're moving on to key battle number 3. Really more a campaign than a single battle. Seldom will we actually just do one battle. We're always going to give you the lead up to it and then the aftermath, and sometimes there will be some minor battles in between. This is one that not a lot of people know about, even people who have taken some history. I started to say, Scott, the man on the street, but if you stop the man on the street and start asking him history questions, forget it.
Yeah.
The average man on the street or woman on the street knows next to nothing. So even if let's say you took somebody who was a history major and just had an undergrad, let's say, they may not know about this, or at least not much. I mean, a lot of people know about Bunker Hill, Lexington and Concord, Saratoga, Yorktown, certainly. But we're going to talk about the American attempt to take over Canada, specifically the attack on the fortress city of Quebec. But before we get there, we left off after Bunker Hill last time. Let's talk a little bit more about the reaction to Bunker Hill on both sides. We touched on a little bit of the reaction last time, but we want to go into more detail. So, again, Bunker Hill was a very bloody battle. For the British, it's going to be the bloodiest battle of the entire war. Of course, they don't know that at the time. They can't, obviously they don't have foresight, and they can't say, "Oh, well, we got smushed here. we lost too many people." But that's okay. Every other battle will be less. So it really it's a wake-up call for the British, even though technically it was a British victory in that they drove the Americans from the field and completely off the Charlestown Peninsula. Nevertheless, the carnage shocked battle-hardened veterans as well as rookies. Now, the Second Continental Congress, and from now on, we're just going to call them Congress. It's much shorter, and the Second Continental Congress for several years is going to be the actual government of the United States of America. It will be supplemented by the Confederation Congress later, so we'll just call it Congress. They greeted the news of Bunker Hill with jubilation. Again, there was a sense that, hey, we can actually fight. We're not that bad after all. And if we'd had more ammo, and if we had a little bit more training, and perhaps if we'd stayed on Breeds Hill like we were supposed to. I mean, I'm sorry, I always mix that up, Scott. If we had stayed on Bunker Hill, they were supposed to be on Bunker Hill, but instead they moved to Breeds Hill.
If people had named it the right way, it wouldn't be a problem, so it's not your fault.
Oh, well, I mix that up almost every time. On July 6th, not too long after the battle, Congress produced a document. And this, by the way, this is 1775, everyone. So don't think, 2 days after the 4th of July. I mean, yes, in one sense it was, but this is not the 4th of July. That'll be later. Anyway, on July 6, 1775, Congress produced a document called the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. It was written by John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, but Dickinson used an earlier draft written by Thomas Jefferson. I believe, Scott, this is the first time his name has popped up, at least officially. Jefferson, in writing that, even though it was revised by John Dickinson, Jefferson is developing a reputation for being a really good writer. So remember that, folks. There's a little foreshadowing for you. Thomas Jefferson, good writer. All right, so in this Declaration of Causes, the Congress said, "We fight not for glory or conquest, and we mean not to dissolve that union with Britain that has so happily existed between us." Okay, so they're saying specifically, we don't want to dissolve the union. We don't want to break apart from Britain. We're just fighting for our rights. What a difference a year's going to make, huh?
Yeah, wow.
But they go on to state that they were resolved to die free men rather than to live as slaves. And there's some irony there in a lot of these delegates to Congress are Southerners who own slaves, and they're saying that Britain has made them into slaves. But I think we'll table that discussion for now, if that's okay, Scott. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. So here they're justifying what they've done. At the same time, roughly a couple days later, on July 8th, they send a document that comes to be known as the Olive Branch Petition. It's written also by John Dickinson, and it's written specifically to the king, addressed to King George III. This document stated that the colonists would end their armed rebellion if the king would withdraw British military forces from the colonies and revoke the intolerable acts that we talked about way back in our first episode. And not everybody was really wild about the idea of even writing this and sending it. For example, John Adams and other pro-independence delegates, Samuel Adams, others, they thought the Olive Branch Petition was a waste of time. But we will see what happens when the king gets it a little bit later. Scott, you wanted to say something about John Dickinson?
Yeah, I just want to mention a little about him. I won't stray too far off because this is a military history podcast, but I think Dickinson is a good avatar for the more conservative view that's going on, so you can see what is the climate as people are fighting these battles. So Dickinson is sort of, I don't want to say a second-tier founding father. He's second-tier in the sense that his name simply isn't as well known. That would include the likes of George Mason, John Marshall, Francis Marion, some other different people too. Henry Lee. We'll meet these different characters later on.
Richard Henry Lee, Joseph Warren, who was killed at Bunker Hill. Yeah, there's a lot of those.
John Carroll and
yeah, they did a lot, but they just didn't really make the cut into the survey courses, you know?
Yeah, so I recommend Brian McClanahan. He has a podcast. He's a very much an originalist in his constitutional thoughts, but he can dig into all sorts of things on the founding fathers. So anyway, what I want to mention with Dickinson, he's called the conservative revolutionary, and I don't mean conservative in the contemporary sense, but in the he wants to conserve the old order and make changes, not radically, but more incrementally. But he was a pamphleteer who is a key figure in the colonies at almost every stage, from the first stirrings of independence, from the Stamped Act in Congress in 1765, all the way up to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He's a governor of both states in Pennsylvania and Delaware. He's a very well-known political figure in both those areas. He frames the Articles of Confederation. He has heavy influence on the Constitution as well. But like what you mentioned, James, even up to a year later, Dickinson is still hoping for conciliation between Britain and the colonies. Am I going to spoil anything by saying how he votes on the Constitution?
The Declaration?
Declaration, yeah, sorry. He votes against it, and the vote is by states and not delegates, but he made a resounding speech talking against it, and that he doesn't oppose independence in principle, but he didn't believe that the colonies were ready for war against England, that, well, we don't have any foreign alliances, and we don't have a plan yet for a stronger union. So later on, he said that it was the timing and not the idea of independence that led him to vote no. And after he retires from Congress, after his vote, he does take up arms against the British as a brigadier general in the Pennsylvania militia. But before leaving in July 1776, he drafted a plan called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And this influences some of the early governing documents of the United States. So just want to mention Dickinson as some of these different voices. The founding fathers are never, ever speaking with one clear voice on anything. And I think Dickinson is a good representation of more conservative approach to politics.
Yeah, all right, definitely. So let's see what the reaction to Bunker Hill was, and on the other side of the pond. So we talked about the Olive Branch Petition. It was written by John Dickinson and endorsed by Congress, at least for the most people in Congress. It was sent to King George, and King George got it. He opened it, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's really reasonable. Sure, no problem. I'll just do everything you say, colonists. I'll get rid of the army. I'll get rid of the intolerable acts. No problem." I'm lying, by the way. Of course, everybody does.
Nope.
Yeah. He rejected it soundly. He did the exact opposite of what I just said. The British Prime Minister was named Lord North, and North told the king the rebellion should be treated as a foreign war. And the king issued a proclamation saying, in essence, that the gloves had to come off. In other words, far from giving in to the demands of these rebels, I'm going to crack down. I'm going to crush this rebellion. Parliament passed an act prohibiting trade and commerce with Europe from the colonies. All American ships were subject to capture and confiscation. So things are getting heated here. They're getting ugly. John Adams, always good for a quote, right? John Adams, in our Civil War series, it was always William T. Sherman. He was the king of the great pithy quote. Well, John Adams is not pithy.
No, not at all. George Washington is pithy.
He was never called a man of few words. That would be George Washington, but Adams was a man of many words, but he often had very interesting things to say. He wrote this. He said, King, lords, and commons have united in sundering this country from that, I think, forever. It is a complete dismemberment of the British Empire. It makes us independent in spite of our supplications and entreaties. So in other words, he's saying, number one, this is the king and the British government's fault. And number two, basically, we're already independent for all intents and purposes. You know, in this time period between now and 1776, I should mention that most of the colonies are already forming separate governments. They're the royal governors, the ones that are still around, they don't really have much authority, if any. Sometimes it's just limited to one city. And the colonists are setting up rival governments. We'll call them patriot governments and legislatures and things like that. So we're definitely starting to move in the direction of independence. But it's going to be a little while before it becomes official. Okay, so the British Army. Let's talk about that. We talked in detail about what an individual British soldier was like in a previous episode. But now let's look at the top level. Let's go up at 30,000 feet, so to speak. The British Army only had about 38,000 people, soldiers, and the Navy only had about 18,000 sailors. And they only had 29 ships in North America, only 3 of which were ships of the line. Okay, and I don't want to go into too much detail about the different kinds of ships, but a ship of the line is a term we'll use again and again, and that is the best kind of warship there was at the time. It's a ship that has lots of guns. You know, sometimes I don't know what the minimum requirement is for it to be considered a ship of the line, 50 or something like that. But I'm not an expert on naval combat, but 50, 60, 70. Some of them, we're going to see one later toward the end of the series that has 100 guns. You know, that's just amazing. So these are basically battleships. They didn't call them battleships, but these are the 18th century equivalent of battleships, the biggest, most powerful ships, but they only had 3. And a lot of the Army and Navy were needed in other parts of the world. So obviously, Britain is in the process of building a vast overseas empire, and they have more to think about than just the American colonies. There's other colonies as well. In fact, the colonies they had in the Caribbean were much more valuable financially. They made a lot more money for Britain than the North American colonies. So even though, yes, the British Army was one of the best, if not the best in the world, and definitely the best Navy in the world, it's not like they could just send over an unlimited number of soldiers and sailors. So that's going to be a challenge for them.
That's a good thing to keep in mind when we consider the actions of British High Command, because sometimes it seems they're not doing enough. Later on in the war, you'll see something that I've heard one professor describe as a surge, similar to 2007 with U.S. forces in Iraq, to try to ramp up forces to quickly knock out the Revolutionary War, because Britain has concerns in its other colonies. You mentioned the Caribbean, but now they're setting up colonies in Canada, the West Indies, New Zealand. This is shortly after Captain James Cook claims it for the British Crown in 1769. They have naval bases in the Mediterranean. They have trading posts in India. Now, this is before the full British might of the 19th century, where they have complete control of Australia and massive holdings in Africa. After the Revolutionary War, Britain enters into what some historians have called the Second British Empire, where they have more direct control over things, and new technologies enables them to do that. But Britain has a lot on its plate, and America is only one theater of its operations and its politics and its warfare that's happening, if that makes sense, of why they make the decisions that they do.
Okie doke. Good point. So, manpower. So, we were just talking about how the British Army had only 38,000 soldiers, and a lot of them are occupied in other places. So King George doesn't really have enough men to send over to really put down this rebellion. So to solve the problem of manpower, he chose to hire German mercenaries. The Patriots heavily criticized this. In fact, this is going to be one of the grievances that's listed out specifically in the Declaration of Independence. But the hiring of mercenaries had a long tradition in Europe, going way, way back, at least to the Middle Ages and probably even earlier. I'm not an expert on ancient history, but...
Oh, yeah. Like half of Machiavelli's The Prince is about mercenaries.
Yeah. So it's not like King George he just came up with this new horrible thing. He was just doing what was standard part of the business at the time. If you don't have enough guys, you hire some more. The mercenaries came from all over the German lands. And of course, most of our listeners will know that there was no united Germany at this time. Germany was divided into a large number of small principalities and duchies and dukedoms, or I don't know if dukedom is the right word, but just little states. But the most famous mercenary producing state at the time was Hesse-Kassel. And because most of the mercenaries that were hired by King George III and sent over to North America came from this area, they were called Hessians, and not just them, but all of the mercenaries. So even you might have had somebody, let's say, from Bavaria or Prussia. They would still be called a Hessian. These guys we'll talk about them in more detail later when we talk about the Battle of Trenton, but these guys, I'll just say for now, were professional, tough soldiers. You know, these were scary kind of people. These are like the New England Patriots of of soldiers. They were fearsome and had a fearsome reputation. By the end of the war, about 18,000 Hessians would serve with the British. They didn't send 18,000 at first, but by the time it was over, that's about how many came over. Another thing the British did was they didn't really think General Gage, we've talked about Gage a few times, they didn't think he was doing a good job. So Gage gets a pink slip. He gets recalled to London. He's replaced with one of the three generals that was sent over earlier in 1775, and that would be William Howe. So Howe is going to be a very important figure for the next several years. So let's give him a little bit of a mini biography here. William Howe. General Howe joined the army in 1746. He saw extensive service in the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. He became known for his role in the capture of Quebec, which we're going to talk about another attempted capture of Quebec. But just for now, suffice it to say that during the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, at least in Europe, the British attacked Quebec, which at that time was held by the French, and Howe led a daring attack. He led a force to capture the cliffs at Anse-à-Foulon. I don't know if I said that right, but anyway, they scaled up this very steep cliff, and they allowed General James Wolfe, the commander at the time, to land his army and engage the French in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. So Howe also participated in the campaigns to take Louisburg, Belle Isle, and Havana, Cuba. So very distinguished career, lots of military experience. He was the hero of Bunker Hill. We saw that he was the person in field command of the British forces at Bunker Hill, and he bravely led them personally in 3 charges, the third of which, of course, succeeded. And he was also the youngest of 3 military brothers. The oldest, George, had been killed in the French and Indian War, and the second, Richard Howe, was the commander of the British fleet in North America. So that's kind of cool, Scott. For a while, at least, the British have 2 brothers, one in command of the Army and one in command of the Navy. The oldest brother, who was killed in the French and Indian War, when he was killed, the grateful Massachusetts Assembly at the time paid for a monument to him to be placed in Westminster Abbey. And because of this really nice gesture on the part of the Massachusetts Assembly, remember, this is long before the Troubles started, but because of their generosity, Richard and William Howe looked very fondly upon the American colonists. So we have to remember, for William Howe, putting down this rebellion was his job, but it wasn't something he just really had a visceral attachment to. It's not like, oh, I hate Americans, I'm going to crush this rebellion. No, he liked Americans.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. I'd like to think that before he ordered the troops to fire, he would mutter under his breath, "No hard feelings, gentlemen." So think about it that way.
Or maybe he said, it's not personal, it's business.
What's that from?
That is from The Godfather, I think.
Oh, okay.
You hear that quoted all the time.
Yeah,
it's not personal, it's business.
It's one of those movies, there's so many quotes that there's a few to slip through the cracks.
Yeah, it's hard to remember them all. I haven't seen The Godfather in probably 20 years or more, but anyway, so there we go. That leads us up to the attempt to take Quebec. So shall we dive right into that? Okay, let's do it. Now, when I use the term Canada, today we think of a gigantic country north of the United States with a lot of provinces. But at the time, Canada was one big mass. It wasn't divided into provinces. Part of it was what is today Ontario, and part of it was the province of Quebec. The province of Quebec was Lower Canada, and the province of although I don't even think they divided at this point. I'm getting my two wars mixed up. I did some reading on 1812 recently, so I think at this time it's just one big province. So Canada, think a big province. And again, it had belonged to France, but after the French and Indian War, when the British, of course, won the war, defeated the French, and at the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France gave up Canada to Britain.
Yeah, one thing I just want to mention to give a little context, in order for this campaign to make sense, because this episode is called the Quebec Campaign. So we're going to get into Canada, and we may wonder, why on earth would there be a campaign into Canada when it seems very far away from the theaters of battle, and it doesn't really make sense. There's different reasons. As James mentioned, it's not as far-flung as we would think of it being. But another reason is that some of the strategy is to exploit political fault lines between Britain and France and other places that still exist after the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War is really only a tiny offshoot of the global 7 Years' War. I mean, this is a massive war that involves every European great power. It's almost a proto-world war that there's fighting in Europe, the Americas, West Africa, South Asia, the Philippines. The French Indian is a theater of battle, this giant global war, and this is what put Britain in its bankrupt position. So there were basically two coalitions. One was led by Great Britain and includes Prussia, Portugal, and other small German states. And the other is led by France and includes the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, Spain, the Swedish Empire. This is almost like a dry run for the Revolutionary War. And when we think of alliances that are going to happen later in the Revolutionary War, the foreign help that America receives, part of it is in context of this. And as we look at this Patriot campaign into Canada, they're trying to exploit some of the tensions left over afterwards. Kind of like after World War I and World War II, there's simmering tension between Germany and other Europeans after World War I that can explain World War II. These simmering tensions between Britain and France and others after the 7 Years' War can explain what's going to happen next. So that's all my little piece right there.
All right, very good. So Canada had been generally peaceful and stable under the governorship of Sir Guy Carleton. Guy Carleton was appointed as the Governor General of Canada in 1768, and he's going to actually hold that position all through the American Revolution and well and after it. It'll last until 1788, so 20 years. The Americans really wanted the Canadians to join in the revolution, but as we've seen, why would you do that if you have a good governor, if you have a stable government? So in May of 1775, when the Continental Congress issued a call to the residents of Canada to join the revolution, they declined. I said, no, we'll sit this one out. We're good. Thank you very much. Thanks, but no thanks. And at the same time as this, Congress appointed Philip Schuyler, and this is the father of the famous Schuyler sisters from the Hamilton musical, which there will be many references. That should probably be my drinking thing, Scott.
Hamilton?
Yeah, anytime, listener, that I bring up something, if I give a reference to the Hamilton musical, there's your cue to take a drink, okay? And again, please don't do this if you're driving, but if you're at home, there you go. The Schuyler sisters, my first Hamilton reference. It will not be the last. But anyway, Philip Schuyler is appointed commander of the Northern Department, and Congress said, plan an invasion of Canada. So he says, okay, I'll plan it. But he said, my health is not really all that great, so I'm not going to go on this thing that I'm planning. I'm not going to go on this invasion. How about I delegate it to somebody else? So he delegates it to General Richard Montgomery. So Montgomery steps off in August of 1775. He takes 1,200 men and several boats, and he marches up Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River. And again, you're going to need a map probably for this one. It would be very helpful. I can't even do the mental map thing right now. Just think of a north-south river with a lake kind of in the middle of it, more or less.
Just Google Canada, people. Come on, work with us here, people.
Yeah, I can't always do your work for you, folks. Come on. Just Google the 1775 Quebec attack. If you just Google Quebec attack, you're probably going to get the French and Indian War one, which is the wrong one. We talked about that earlier, but now we're talking about the Revolutionary War one. Okay, so he marches up Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River to Fort St. John, which is just across the St. Lawrence River from Quebec. So he's still in what is going to be called the United States. It's going to become part of the United States, but he's not in Canada. He launches 2 assaults on the fort, but neither works. And then he laid siege to the fort. Finally, by November, 3 months later, the fort surrenders to Montgomery. Half of the entire British regular army of Canada now had become his prisoners, and the road to Montreal was clear. So we see here a really good start to this attack, this march toward Canada, toward Quebec. Montgomery, good job, Montgomery. Took prisoners, took a fort, and now he's ready to march, hop across the river and land in Canada. But it gets more complicated. It gets even more interesting because just as we saw that there were 2 leaders of the attack on Fort Ticonderoga a while back, Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, now we see that there's going to be 2 attacks on Canada. And one of them is going to be led by that very same man we just mentioned. Ladies and gentlemen, present to you once again, Benedict Arnold.
If you have sympathies for Benedict Arnold, this is for you, dear listener. If you're any pro Benedict Arnold people out there, this episode is for you.
I think I saw about 3 hands go up, Scott. So that's not very many, but hey, you're going to love this part. So, and by the way, the rest of you, if you hate Benedict Arnold, try to put that on the shelf for now. Okay. Try to pretend you don't know what he does later. Because
it will make his fall from grace that much sweeter. So you can enjoy it in that way.
Yeah. Arnold's going to do a lot of good before he does his bad. Let's just put it that way. So we've already seen number 1, Arnold, as I touched upon a minute ago. Arnold was the co-leader of the successful attack on Fort Ticonderoga, which led to a lot of supplies for the Continentals. Now, Arnold is the kind of man that is restless. Arnold is a man that doesn't want to just sit around. He's not an office jockey. He can't ride a desk. He's got to be out doing things, leading attacks, marching in the field. So that's exactly what he wants to do. In mid-June of 1775, Arnold proposed a plan to Congress in which he would rally the habitants, and that's about as good a French as I could ever do.
I always have to use forvo.com with anything French. It's a pronunciation website. Yeah. Otherwise, it's hopeless.
The habitants, it's spelled like, it looks in English like habitants, but they're inhabitants, basically. These are French speakers. French-speaking people who lived in Canada. They had come over, their ancestors had come over when France ruled it, when Britain took over Canada, a lot of the French people stayed. So they're French people living under British rule. And some of them were not happy being under British rule. So Arnold was hoping he could stir up these people, tell them, hey, you don't have to live under British rule. Why don't you live under American rule? We'll be so much nicer too. Well, even the British actually gave him a lot of freedom. But anyway, he was hoping to stir them up against the British, and he was hoping to take control of Montreal, which is another major fortified city, and then Quebec. Congress approved the plan, and also George Washington gave his blessing to this plan. And Arnold paid for this entire thing just about with his own money. He was paid back. He was reimbursed later, but only for about 2/3 of that. So tuck that away for later. Arnold is not going to be happy. He's going to feel like he's always having to spend money out of his own pocket, and Congress doesn't appreciate him enough to pay him back. But for now, no time to think about that. We've got an attack to lead, right? Arnold and his soldiers, this is the plan. And by the way, Arnold is going to have a company of Virginia riflemen led by a man named Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan was another veteran of the French and Indian War, and he's going to have a big future. That name's going to get called several times. Daniel Morgan. So these are riflemen. Okay, we talked about muskets last time that were smoothbore. These are These are muskets with long barrels and rifling inside of the barrel to put a spin on the bullet to make it more accurate. These guys are the equivalent of snipers. They would have said sharpshooters, but they also usually just called them riflemen. So the plan is for Arnold and his soldiers, including the riflemen led by Daniel Morgan, to sail to the mouth of the Kennebec River, and that's in modern-day Maine. Maine was not a separate colony or a state for quite some time. It would not become a state until 1820. It was part of Massachusetts. So their plan was to move up the Kennebec, and again, just think of Maine, and you're getting on this river, which is kind of in the southern part of Maine, and then you're going north toward Canada. Then they were going to transfer over land to the Chaudière River. And again, I may have mispronounced that, if so, I apologize. And then they were going to move up this river straight to Quebec. Remember, folks, that back in this day, travel by water was so much quicker in general than land travel, that you didn't have any good roads. I mean, that was true in the Civil War, but especially in the Revolutionary War. Land travel was exceedingly slow. So they're going to go up one river, switch over to another river, and that river would take them straight to Quebec. Carleton, Guy Carleton, the British commander in Canada, he would be forced to do one of two things. He would have to move troops from Montreal to Quebec, because Quebec was very lightly defended, or he would have to leave Quebec undefended, neither of which was good. So think about this. If he leaves Quebec unattended, then Arnold would just march right in, grab it, and done. But if Carleton were to move troops from Montreal, which is a little bit to the south and the west, and move them up to Quebec, then Montreal would be weak and Richard Montgomery could grab it. So it seemed like a really good plan on paper, but we've seen that before, and great plans on paper often don't translate to be great plans on the field or on the ground. Okay, so here's Arnold and his troops. They're marching up north through Maine, what is now Maine, and they're going along this river. But along the way, everything starts to go wrong. They encounter heavy rain. They encounter an early frost and a hostile wilderness. And their maps were inaccurate. They had to carry their boats some of the time. Food ran low, shoes wore out, and one battalion simply quit and left. A lot of the boats were very poor quality and they leaked. So it was great suffering along this march. Very difficult. People got sick. People died. There are stories of men taking their moccasins or their shoes and boiling them and eating them. That doesn't sound like a very appetizing dinner, does it, Scott?
That sounds like people going to the Northwest Passage back in the 1850s and under total starvation conditions, which some of them would have been in. So this is pretty brutal.
This is not that far north, but pretty far north. And so you either eat your shoes or you die. And then, of course, if you eat your shoes, now you're walking barefoot through the snow. So things are getting worse and worse.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
After 51 days, on the 8th of November, and remember, this is November in northern Maine / southern Canada, southeastern Canada, southeastern, around Quebec. So it's cold. It is really cold. One of Arnold's soldiers, but they reach it on November 8th. They reach Quebec, and one of Arnold's soldiers wrote in his diary, "It was the most prodigious march ever accomplished by man." That's a pretty bold claim, huh, Scott?
Yeah.
The most prodigious march ever accomplished by man. Well, maybe it'll tie for that. I'm not really sure, but there's been some other impressive marches. But in other words, that's how they felt anyway. Quebec only had 7 cannon and a few hundred second-rate guards. They didn't exactly have the crack British forces. These are guys that weren't good enough to go out in the regular army. They were given garrison duty. But Arnold only had about 650 men left, so he decided to rest his exhausted soldiers just outside of Quebec. While the Americans were resting, fortunately for the British, unfortunately for Arnold, several hundred British or Allied troops arrived to reinforce the city. Some of these were Canadian militia, some were regular British troops. So the city gets beefed up. The garrison does, that is. Finally, Arnold and his men crossed the St. Lawrence River, scaled the cliffs, just as had been done during the French and Indian War. They assembled at the Plains of Abraham, which is obviously you could tell it's a plain, it's a flat area, but it's outside of the city walls. Arnold demanded the city surrender 3 times, but the British commander refused 3 times. I get a little chuckle out of that. Surrender. No. And then, well, okay, now surrender. No. All right, come on, please.
You have to feel pretty cozy when you're being under siege, but in your well-stocked fort in the winter in Canada while the people are outside freezing and shivering and starving.
Yeah, and so then Arnold decided to march around the city wall 7 times and blow trumpets, and then the walls came tumbling down.
Fun fact, in the First Crusade, that's what the Crusaders did when they arrived at Jerusalem. I don't know if they went around the wall 7 times, but they did go around once. So they thought, let's use some of that Old Testament magic. I don't believe, James, they did that this time, so sorry, I'm going to have to correct you. But
you're going to have to call me on that. Okay, maybe.
But you know what? There is a tradition of people doing this. It's not unprecedented.
When I make a joke, listeners, you can also take a drink, and especially if Scott calls me on it, you can do too. But,
yeah. Oh man, we're just filling up our Madiar glasses today.
So maybe it worked for Joshua, but it's not going to work for Arnold. He doesn't even try it. Arnold, finally, he can't talk. For some reason, he can't talk these British into surrendering. It's just like, come on, I said 3 times. It's like the people in the fort are saying, what part of no don't you understand? So Arnold finally decides, we need to try something else. He gave up the siege on November 18th. He moved 20 miles upstream toward Montreal, and he decided to wait for Montgomery to arrive and reinforce him. So he's thinking, well, let me just get more troops, and then maybe we'll try a full-scale assault. On November 11th, and this is a week prior to Arnold giving up the siege, Carleton had ordered Montreal abandoned. He went downriver toward Quebec. Along the way, he encountered a group of colonials who demanded his surrender. And this is kind of an exciting story here. This would make a good movie or a book. Maybe there is a novel. I mean, not a regular history book, although those are fun too. But Montgomery, I'm sorry, Carleton is the British commander, remember, and he's in Montreal. He leaves Montreal with a force. He almost gets captured, but he escapes in disguise. I always love it when they disguise themselves. And eventually he reaches Quebec, where he took command. So Arnold was hoping for reinforcements to arrive, but I don't think he had British reinforcements in mind. He wanted Montgomery. Montgomery is nowhere to be seen. So things don't get better for Arnold at the gates of Quebec. They get a little bit worse.
Do we know what Carleton disguised himself as?
I did not find that information. I don't know. It's probably just nothing real exciting.
A French fur trapper or
yeah, probably just something really like a common man. Probably just ditch the uniform and just dress like an ordinary civilian or something. That would be my guess.
It's not like he would do anything exotic, like a
bear costume.
Yeah, exactly.
Or a clown suit. No.
Yeah, I was trying to think. That's what I came to mind. Thought, did they have those in the 18th century? Probably not, but that's for another time, listeners. Well, yeah, I just want to add a couple of other things here that some people after the fact have assessed the problems with this campaign leading up to Montreal. There were some things that were out of control of preparation, not knowing weather conditions and some of those challenges. But two other challenges. First is that the route that Arnold took through Maine wilderness in southern Canada, James mentioned that their maps were incorrect. Part of the reason their maps were incorrect is that that area was highly speculative. There hadn't been many people who had traveled it. There'd only been a few bands of Indians and trappers. So there simply wasn't good, reliable information like there would be with reliable routes going through Ohio, for example. So essentially nothing was known about it. The other challenge is that the expedition was made up of mostly young men. The American High Command wanted active woodsmen to go on this journey, thinking they could fare better. Instead, what they got were inexperienced soldiers, and many of these rifleman companies were Scotch-Irish immigrants, and there are many Scotch-Irish immigrants to the colonies at this point. And to be sure, they were brave, they were hardy, they were rough and tumble, they could undergo hardship, but they didn't know anything about wilderness survival or about handling small boats going across rivers or being able to do portage, things like that. The other challenge or the problem is that in the First Continental Congress in October 1774, John Jay wrote a broadside. He addressed the people of Great Britain and he insulted French jurisprudence and Roman Catholicism in very clear terms. The problem with this is that it alienated the Roman Catholic clergy in French Canada, and they started to lecture their flocks from the pulpit against the 13 Protestant colonies. So you're bringing Protestant Catholic divides, which have always been low-level boiling after the 30 Years' War 100 years earlier, after a very, very brutal, violent war on the European mainland. Things have simmered down since then, but it's kind of easy to stoke those flames. So alienating Catholics with the rhetoric in the First Continental Congress was something that made culturally French and linguistically French people in Canada not so happy to join the patriotic cause.
Yeah, that was not very smart on the part of the colonials. Let's just go ahead and insult their religion. Yeah, that's a really great way to win friends and influence people.
So what do you think, James? Should we talk about what happens at Quebec, or should we just leave people hanging on a cliffhanger?
I say we leave them hanging.
Exactly. You know, there's a lot of anxiety around the troops about what would happen. So, dear listener, we want to give you a small taste of what it would be like to not know what your fate is going to be by having to spend 5 or 10 seconds waiting to click over to the next podcast. So that's how we immerse you in the historical experience. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast. If you'd like more info, go to keybattlesoftherevolutionarywar.com, where you'll find show notes, maps, and other resources that we talk about in these episodes. And if you like the show, please rate and review us on the podcast player of your choice. It helps us grow the show and reach new listeners. Until next time, my friends, grab your tankard of ale or glass of Madeira and raise a toast to liberty.